Hi everyone, my name is Sabera. So daily we are faced with numerous decisions to make and problems to solve, yet sometimes that can be pretty difficult. It's questions like what do we know, what do we do, and what do we believe that are the most difficult to answer. Yet, with critical thinking, we can find those solutions. In our readings, John Passmore stated how critical thinking isn't just a habit, but it's actually a skill that shows us what's important about the issues and also how to go about for finding more information. So we have to be critical because we have to ask the important questions to get that information to make our reasoning in life. So what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the speech is basically critical thinking and our BS detectors. Passmore discusses how we must not be pawns to the ideas of others. If we constantly reiterate the ideas that other people are giving, we don't leave room for creative thinking and authenticity. If we only reiterate the other ideas of others, we don't leave room, basically, for critical thinking. And one way we are doing that is with authoritative figures. See, authoritative figures limit our creative thinking, and one example would be Milgram's experiment. In Milgram's experiment, we had, the researchers kind of influence the participants, specifically the participant that was shocking the other people. Even though the person who was giving the shocks consciously knew that they were doing something that was hurting another person, they didn't question what the researcher was giving. They just kept on pushing a limit to the max, and then they ended up becoming a mindless follower. See, another example of that would be in our social setting of education. See, sometimes it's professors who are authoritative barriers to our critical thinking, and personally, I can relate to this. When I compare my high school education compared to my college education, they're pretty different. In high school, it was pretty much that if you went away from the conventional norms, you were kind of frowned upon, and that's kind of sad. While also in the classroom settings, students didn't really question the ideas of others or the opinions. And so at that point, where do we leave room for critical thinking? Now, flashback into college, we're taking this class that basically is only about critical thinking mostly in our debates. And so when we're in this class, we learn how to be critical thinkers because we have to understand the information that people are giving us and see different points of view of an issue. During our debate, we had to critically think of how our solution is going to be for issues, and also make sure that others understood it. Whether you had a fact, value, or policy debate, every single person had to put their own input into their briefs. As the debate went on, we had to critically think of alternatives or approaches to the problem. We have to question our sources and find counter-arguments that the other person might make, and in that end, it can really affect the voting count. Now, when it comes to being in the cross-examination, we all had to think thoroughly of our answers. Now switch the role to the voter. Once we understood what the speaker was trying to convey, we had to really critically think of the arguments that they were making and break it down, because in the end, that's how we're making our decisions. And not only as a voter, we have to use our critical thinking, but we have to use our BS detector, because without our BS detector, we don't know if someone's really deceiving us. So throughout this quarter, I have learned that my BS detector has actually evolved in a lot of ways. And in this class, during the debates, it's mostly by looking at the verbal and nonverbal cues that we have. So it can be like lack of eye contact, stumbling through your cross-examination questions, or not even validating your sources that are the really big factors that I looked into. As a BS detector is an important skill, without one we'd just be taken advantage of. And so I'm going to keep on evolving my BS detector, especially in politics. And now I had a policy debate, so that's kind of probably why I'm being more judgmental of policy, but also because policy is really important for all of us. And if we don't question what other people are instituting, so our laws or any other things like that, then ultimately we're just going to become mindless followers. So even though I know that my BS detector may be at fault at times with policy, I know that my critical thinking will actually make up for it, so I do not become that mindless follower. So in conclusion, I've learned that critical thinking is important, and critical thinking allows us to analyze, reason, evaluate, problem solve, and decision make, which all are important factors for life.
Dana? Of the paper?
Oh, yeah. Thanks. Sorry. Fine, I'll take everyone. So, hi, I'm Dana, and I'm going to talk about critical thinking, my BS detector, specifically in terms of Milgram and my own experiences and like the BDS debate that I went to for extra credit as well. So the prompt states that critical thinking is the mental process of knowing what to do or what to believe. For me, critical thinking is keeping an open mind while also being skeptical and questioning the information that you're getting. So even though you are, being skeptical of this person and not necessarily agreeing to what they say, you're also giving them the opportunity to speak and to hear them out. So something that Passmore mentions that I think is important is that you can't teach someone to think critically by just giving them facts. So, like Shane and Severa mentioned, that's something that we, learn in high school. They tell you to do this and do that in order to think and analyze essays when really there is no one way to do it. And I think of this in terms of I love to act, and when I get a new audition script or something like that, there's no right way to do it. You can read as many articles as you want on how to act, yet when you look at it, the way I interpret the sides and the breakdown of the character is going to be completely different than the person standing next to me. So another thing that I think is important that Passmore mentions is that critical thinking involves taking initiative, having independence, courage, and imagination. So I think these are all the skills that we learned to have in this class. Specifically, when we were asked to stand up at the end of every debate and give our reasoning for why we chose to go with either the government or the opposition, because not only in our society is it easy to conform to the people around you, we had to completely disregard everything, leave our biases at the door, listen to what was being said by both sides, and evaluate it right then and there what we thought based on how we were thinking during the debate. And then we had to get up and explain our reasoning for it, and it had to be sound reasoning as well. So I think that definitely encourages us to do all of those things that Passmore defines as critical thinking. Also, I think that another thing that I think is interesting in Passmore's article is that he says that you can't really learn how to think critically from debating, which he said that it's better for forensic analysis and stuff like that, which I actually think is wrong, but I wouldn't be able to think that that was wrong unless I had thought critically about it. So, I used the skills that he's talking about, because I think that when everyone got up here and debated, that's how we developed our critical thinking skills, by watching different people debate and by deciding, oh, this is what is good, this is what is bad, and what I think is completely different than what someone else thinks. Also, additionally, I think that Milgram's experiment is really important when we discuss critical thinking and how authorities can prevent barriers to that. So obviously in Milgram's experiment, the scientist was the perceived authority, and they continued to tell the volunteer to continue with the experiment, and they did so without even questioning him. So this is really relevant in our society today because of people like Donald Trump, who definitely talks his way around things a lot, and that's something I also noticed that is easy to do in your cross-examination as well. Because, especially in mine, when Christine was cross-examining me, there are definitely things that I didn't know how to answer, and I answered her question with a question, which was just such a Donald Trump move. So that in general just shows how much we listen to, we have to be able to answer our own questions correctly and critically think about things. So with Trump, and he obviously, you don't just listen to him because he's the president of the United States, because a lot of what he says is bullshit. It's helped my BS detector evolve, because, the fact that this class was this quarter has come at such a pertinent time. Especially, I don't know if anybody watched the trial with Jeff Sessions the other day, but he completely talked his way out and stated that he had a privilege, he had to protect the privilege of the president, even though he said that he had no executive privilege to do so. So developing our BS detector is really being a member of the active community. And finally, at the BDS extra credit that I went to, I noticed that the government was yelling a lot, which I thought showed that they were insecure. So I think that something yelling, and I think that there was some yelling in our debates as well, I think that that's something that is a good indicator that people don't necessarily have the best information. I think that ultimately this class taught me how to think critically and make decisions about difficult subjects like climate change and how to detect BS. Thinking critically is something that you have to actively do, And this class taught me that in order to be an active citizen in society and do my community justice, I need to keep my mind open to different possibilities while also questioning what I know.
Jennifer, can someone else time while she's timing?
She got against people yelling in the debates, huh?
What?
She got against people yelling in the debates.
Can you go a little bit this way, please? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jen. So I've only encountered a couple professors that have actually allowed me to freely speak my mind, free of their individual biases and judgments. And Professor Miller is one of them because he doesn't tell students what to think, but he allows us to question our own systems of thinking so that we can liberate our own minds. And I think critical thinking is significant in the classroom and beyond to allow us to understand the logical connections between ideas and develop a mind of our own. Throughout this class, my critical thinking skills have greatly developed and my BS detector has become more alert than ever. And I'll explain how this happened through Passmore's essay on teaching to be critical, personal experiences, my favorite TED Talk called Do Schools Kill Creativity, and Milgram's experiment. And this will explain my rapid development in critical thinking and why I think it's important. So growing up, I only really experienced what Passmore calls indoctrinators. So I only had teachers that told me information. I was never really presented with information, then asked to analyze it by myself. And it was one in which teachers never deviated from a fixed syllabus in which masters and students alike frown on every deviation from the conventional norm, as Passmore explains. So these instructors were definitely barriers to my development of robust critical thinking. And then developing a university like UCLA that's public, where I can choose my own major and minor, creates the illusion that I'm able to critically think. However, usually that's not really the case because I have to try to read between the lines and think for my own in a lot of classes where professors just spew information at you. And this class has allowed me to explore an issue that I'd previously only really been drilled with, not asked to consider, which is climate change. So all students at my high school, like me, were well drilled but highly unoriginal. But with Professor Miller, as Passmore calls the Democrat, the commitment is to believing that the majority of people are capable of participating at some level in discussions which lead to a change of rules. The fact that a majority of our class altered their views on climate change before and after we debated them kind of just shows that the Democrat style that he explains and that Professor Miller uses ultimately wins to make us better critical thinkers. And then my favorite TED Talk is called Do Schools Kill Creativity by Ken Robinson, and it includes one of my favorite quotes where he says, Picasso once said that all children are born artists. The problem is to remain an artist as you grow up. I believe this passionately, that we don't grow into creativity, we grow out of it, or rather, we are educated out of it. By studying both sides of the climate change debate and the principles of argumentation, I do not accept the definition of critical thinking as the mental process of going about knowing what to do or what to believe, because this insists that there's one right answer about what to do or what to believe. What I now know is that critical thinking is that mode of thinking about any subject, content, or problem in which the thinker improves the quality of his or her thinking by skillfully analyzing, assessing, and reconstructing it. My emphasis on framing climate change in my debate really helped my BS detector evolve. If the evidence I presented in my debate was framed differently, it would be BS. For example, I said how climate models can accurately predict that global warming is catastrophic because we can't predict the future. Obviously, it's like a fact you can't predict the future. And that really worked in the way that I worded it, whereas Patel pointed out that the point is to give us an idea of what to expect, not perfectly predict it, which is also I could say is BS, so it's kind of in the way that you frame it. And also, I will expand the use of my new BS detector into my other classes by questioning findings only when I have sufficient evidence to back up what I'm saying. And I'll definitely call more BS on others when they frame concepts to benefit themselves and deem them as facts when they're not. And then the Milgram experiment proves that we are obedient to people with authority. Most of the time we do this without question. And I'll make comparison with this experiment and our learning experiences that we've probably all had. There are 3 situational factors that we don't anticipate or believe that make us obedient, and one is the closer the subject is to an authority. So in the Milgram experiment, that was the experimenter telling them to shock so they would do it. For us, that's our professors and teachers growing up telling us to do something so we do it. The second one is the education level in authority. So in the experiment, it was a Yale study, and when people were told that, they were so much more likely to comply, whereas us, we go to UCLA. So if our smart professor tells us something, we're obviously going to believe it without question, which I think is the most interesting point. And then there's a slippery slope effect, which basically, like, they didn't go from 0 volts to 400 volts all of a sudden. They, like, gradually went. So if one professor tells us one thing, we're like, they're right, and then another one does, and then another one does. Until we take a class like this, or Professor Fink's class, like Daniel said, you won't really be able to question your thinking like that. So overall, I've appreciated this class because I've never been told what to think, but instead invited to question my own systems of thinking to explore my mind. So I've used Passmore's essays, the obedience experiment, personal experiences, and my favorite TED Talk to explain how my critical thinking skills have progressed throughout this class and how my BS detector is beeping more quickly and loudly than ever. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, my bad. I'm next, right? Just,
Yeah.
Alright, cool. I'm wearing white, I'm sorry. Floating heads or something.
No, it's pretty visible.
Really?
Cream.
Yeah, it's cream.
No, I'm okay, thank you.
I think it's like slightly pink. You wash it with those shorts?
As long as I stand out. Am I good?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, my name's Louie. You probably already know that, though. First, I will discuss how, as science becomes politicized, people are indoctrinated and unable to think critically. Next, I'll move on to discuss how, in order to think critically, we need to first be skeptical, and then we need to be educated. And finally, I'll discuss how my BS detector has evolved in such a way that I now question the credibility of all sources and all speakers whom I encounter. So first, politics and indoctrination. From the debates in class, I learned that as science becomes politicized, people are indoctrinated and unable to think critically about scientific issues, such as climate change. Science itself is very politicized when it comes to climate change. According to the Pew Research Center, Democrats and liberals are more likely than Republicans and conservatives to say that the Earth is warming. However, both liberal supporters and conservative supporters tend to overwhelmingly listen to their party leaders and take on their beliefs as their own, not critically thinking. And at the same time, the party leaders themselves won't go against the doctrines of their overarching party, as not to alienate their support base. So you get this environment where both supporters and leaders alike aren't questioning their party's doctrine and just simply going along with it and not thinking critically. According to Passmore, in his article on teaching to be critical, indoctrination is no way to teach critical thinking. This is because indoctrination doesn't allow for the free flow and process of critical thinking. One example of this is the Milgram experiment, where we see that people will follow authority in their doctrines even if it means harming others, and in this case, harming the environment. So this begs the question, what does it take then to think critically? Well, first, it takes being skeptical. According to Passmore, to exhibit a critical spirit, one must be alert to the possibility that the established norms themselves ought to be rejected, that the rule ought to be changed, the criteria used in judging performances modified. In other words, in order to think critically, one needs to go beyond what is commonly accepted, analyzing all the facts and information that they're presented and formulating their own viewpoints. One example of this comes from one of the journal assignments where we were asked to question someone's evidence. So I had a scenario where a friend of mine is like, I could sell a pair of shoes for $1,500, and I was skeptical immediately. I thought, this is BS, no way. So he presents me with a source that was a written article saying that someone recently had sold a pair of shoes for that amount. But I still remained skeptical and closely scrutinized the source, finding that it wasn't the same pair of shoes that my friend had. So therefore, by being skeptical, first my friend's arguments and then his source, I was able to think critically through his arguments and arrive at the conclusion that indeed he cannot sell the pair of shoes for the amount that he claimed. So the second thing that someone needs to do in order to think critically is to be educated. According to Passmore, to be educated, one must be able to participate in the great human traditions of critico-creative thought. Those are science, history, literature, philosophy, and technology. I learned this firsthand through the debates in class when we had to go through numerous sources on the UCLA research database in order to form a well-rounded argument and position on the topic that we were assigned to. So to sum up, in order to think critically, one needs to first be skeptical, and then needs to be educated. So finally, how has my BS detector evolved? Well, my BS detector has evolved in such a way that I now constantly question the credibility of all sources and of all speakers whom I encounter. I learned firsthand through my debate that it's crucial to question the credibility of all sources. Daniel and Leo presented us with a source from the European Union which, upon first glance, appeared to be very credible. However, I checked it out a little bit more and found it wasn't credible. We were able to discredit this in the judges' minds, which I think went a long way towards our group winning the debate, thanks to Sam here. So the next thing that I learned from debates in class was that speakers' credibility needs to be questioned as well. And the key thing that fed into the credibility of speakers was their delivery. Whether they made eye contact with audience members, seemed well rehearsed, well prepared, those speakers usually won adherence to their point of views. And I hope to continue to develop this BS detector by remaining skeptical of the credibility of all sources, information, speakers whom I encounter, and formulating my own viewpoints on these people and on these sources. Finally, to sum up my arguments as a whole, one, as science becomes politicized, people are indoctrinated and unable to think critically on scientific issues such as climate change. Two, in order to think critically, one needs to first be skeptical and then educated. And three, my BS detector has evolved such that I now question the credibility of all sources and all speakers whom I encounter. Thank you.
Abby?
In the light and the era of fake news, it's really important to critically think about the information that you're presented. And I don't want to offend anyone, but there's a video, which if I could show you I would, but we don't have the time, of Donald Trump supporters being asked by someone what they believe to be true and where they found that evidence. And most of them say they found the evidence on Facebook, Twitter, or they just believe it to be true. And that's something that I think a lot of us experienced in this class, in that we came in thinking climate change is real, and I bet if we had been asked on the first day why, a lot of us would have stumbled over some type of answer and talked about the consensus that we know isn't really a consensus. But critical thinking is that process of sort of going through all the evidence and arriving at what your conclusion is, and not trying to deceive anyone or leave out any points, because we know that's how we formulate our opinion. When I began taking Comm classes, I realized that all the essays that I got assigned were asking me to take a position, follow it up with evidence, and then talk about what the opposing positions were and why those might be true, and then to go back again and say why my position was actually right. And I think this process of arguing within yourself is really important, because you don't deceive anyone by leaving anything out, and I think that's why a lot of us critiqued Al Gore's movie, is because we were only getting one side of everything. Passmore said that one cannot be taught how to critically think just by reading about it. And I think if you think about like back to when you were maybe back to when you were in like 5th grade and learning about like family life and sexual education, I think what your teacher taught you back then does not mean you had any idea how to have sex or anything of that nature, and you were pretty unknowledgeable still after that class. And I think critical thinking is the exact same way, in that you can try to explain to someone how to critically think, but that's not going to teach them a whole lot about actually critically thinking. It's some process that you grow up learning, and in a sense, a lot of you, I think, didn't, including myself, like struggled with that in high school, even though it was something that you were supposed to have been taught. And classes like this and Comm 1 and classes where it's more of a forum between the students rather than just a linear model between the teacher teaching at you, gives you the chance to critically analyze what other students are saying. And in the Milgram obedience to authority, I think it's interesting how we are now having a lot of people up here saying like, oh, I don't want to be that person, or I think I've learned not to be obedient to authority. But I guess one example I can still think of is I think a lot of people maybe didn't like how Professor Miller would say, like, stand up for Jesus or Buddha, because that didn't necessarily represent your views. But there was maybe like one or two snarky comments towards Miller, and the rest of the time people just went along with it just because he's the teacher. And I just want to like make you all aware that like we still do sort of accept authority at times. I know like you don't want to like fight every battle, but I think it is sometimes important to stand up for what you believe in. And my BS detector has evolved in this class when I was evaluating everyone's debates, because I really liked when in the cross-examination people would point out a footnote or something later in the article that discredited their source, because a lot of times a higher up university or the IPCC or something can seem automatically credible, but a lot of times you have to look at the whole picture, which is the whole article. You can't just pick out your quote, because it can backfire on you. And I think Dana and I relied a lot in our debate on the fact that all the evidence was correlational and not a causation, but hinging your whole argument on one point makes it really vulnerable, because if they were able to point out, like, obviously we're talking about a correlation because we can't prove this 100%, then all of our evidence would be, like, thrown out the window. And in conclusion, I've addressed the process of critical thinking, why it's important, and the importance of honing our own critical thinking and BS detector. And we have learned in this class, I think, to take everything with a grain of salt, even like IPCC findings and research university. In a sense, everyone came into this class with their point of view on climate change, and whether it changed a lot or it didn't change at all, we learned to evaluate the evidence that was being given to us. And I think it's really important to continue using our BS detectors and critically analyzing information in classes that have that linear model.
Is Chandler here? Chandler?
Chandler?
Right. Christine? Okay.
Hi everyone, I'm Christine. So one of the biggest takeaways I've had from this class is learning how to critically analyze scientific arguments, specifically those about global warming. We began the quarter by watching Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, which painted a doomsday picture of the effects of global warming. We then listened to the opposing arguments set forth by the great global warming symbol and Bjorn Lomborg's skeptical environmentalist. We heard numerous critiques of both sides' arguments, helping us to understand the strengths and weaknesses of their multiple claims. With this knowledge, we each began to construct our own stance on the issue through class, and in addition to the discussions and debates that helped us think critically about the topic of global warming. From this class, I have learned to develop my own personal BS detector in order to critically analyze the dominant global warming narrative that we hear in this country. I've determined that much of what we hear is an argument made by authority, and if this trend continues, then the topic of global warming is in danger from changing of education to indoctrination. Through this critical analysis, we begin to understand that the strategies used by politicians and scientists, the way that they spread their message about climate change to the public, hinges on their exploitation of their authority that they have over their audience. For example, Al Gore talks about his connections that he has to other important people, like his previous professor and top climate scientist, Roger Revelle. Al Gore himself holds a position of authority as a highly regarded politician as well. Furthermore, Gore and the scientific community discuss the opposing side with an air of mockery, calling them climate deniers and acting incredulous that they would try to argue against global warming in the first place. This supports John Hosmore's observation that critical inquiry of the dominant social force is met by opposition from society. We should be concerned that authority is such a common means of support when debating this topic. Human beings lose their ability to think critically and independently when placed under the command of authority, as is displayed by Milgram's experiment. In the case of global warming, authority seems to be used to distract the public from the glaring holes in some of the scientific theories of climate change. The actual data doesn't always fit the narrative of doom and destruction that's set forth by Al Gore and a lot of the climate scientists. I'm not trying to argue that climate change isn't important, but I'm trying to speculate that the scientific community feels like it has an obligation to urge the public to take action to prevent further harm to the climate. They seem to think that the most effective way to do so is to say that global warming is a catastrophe. Because the public is less likely to act on an imperfect theory, those in power try to steer the global warming narrative away from its flaws by using their authority as scientists and politicians. They get the public to believe their desired narrative simply because they're the ones that get to tell the story. The problem with this is that we're moving away from education and closer to indoctrination regarding this topic of global warming. According to John Passmore, the fundamental difference between the educator and the indoctrinator is that the indoctrinator treats all rules as inherent to the nature of things. What he takes to be fact, as principle, or presents as a person or work to be admired, is deified as beyond the reach of rational criticism. The educator, on the contrary, welcomes criticism and is prepared to admit that he does not always know the answers to them. This quote shows that by arguing from authority, the scientific community and politicians are robbing the public of their ability to critically assess the truth of the situation. This makes the development of critical thinking and a BS detector all the more important. In sum, scientists and politicians argue from authority in order to best achieve their goal of getting the public to take action against global warming. As a result, the topic of climate change is in danger of turning from an educational discussion to one of indoctrination. It is therefore important to develop our critical thinking skills and our BS detector, and most importantly, to pay attention to the messages that are being used. Without our BS detector, we are vulnerable to the message that authority figures tell us. Critical thinking allows us to question authority and whether the information is true, valid, complete, or even something that we agree with. By learning to pay attention, a citizen can become an active participant in the argumentative process and speak out against indoctrination. Thank you.
Kyra?
So, critical thinking is an integral concept to this class because in this class we debate lots of controversial issues that don't have a singular truth or answer at the end of them. So something that I think has been hammered in repeatedly over the course of this quarter is that every issue has multiple sides and points of view. So if you want to engage in critical thinking, which is the process of knowing what to do or believe, then you should educate yourself on all those different sides and points of view, not just what you already believe in or have been told to believe. So specifically for climate change in this class, I think we've learned that climate change is really complex. There's tons of research that both supports it or debunks it. Me personally, I've learned to be more skeptical about climate change. I don't want to just dismiss it entirely or believe it completely, but I just want to remember and be aware that it is complex and I should always consult evidence and research first before coming to any conclusions. And I think this has been helped by the development of my BS detector, which has gotten stronger over the course of the class, through learning how to question and deconstruct other people's arguments instead of blindly believing them. So when I first came into this class, I already felt that my BS detector was okay. I think as someone who uses social media a lot, you see a lot of sensationalist headlines and clickbait article titles, and you just get used to being skeptical and not believing everything you read on the internet. But that being said, climate change is tricky because when it comes to climate change, dissenting opinions get squashed and silenced really quickly and harshly. So because of that, I was never really exposed to contrary ideas or research. So coming into this class, I already believe that climate change is definitely real and definitely linked to human activity. But then the debate started, and in these debates, a lot of us had to argue for unpopular positions or things that we actually personally disagreed with. But despite that, a lot of the opposition groups won their debates, and they had really strong evidence and effective arguments, and the research they cited didn't come out of thin air. I realized watching these debates that there was this whole body of climate skeptical research that I had never been exposed to before. And with that, I realized that prior to this class, I was never really at a position to think critically about climate change because I hadn't educated myself on all these different points of view and all this research that I'd never seen before. Also, through watching these debates, especially the cross-examinations, I've learned how to really question and pick apart other people's arguments. I can't just blindly believe what people tell me anymore. I have to really test the strength and validity of what people tell me, and from there I can think critically and decide what to believe is true or right. Passmore said that critical thinking is something that's really discouraged in the education system prior to university, and I think that's something that's sadly congruent with my experience in education. My teachers in elementary through high school really never encouraged us to disagree with them. They were always really strict on following the curriculum and preparing us for state tests, and they never really taught us how to think outside of the rules or the textbooks. And I think this stems from obedience to authority, which is something explored in Stanley Milgram's experiments. I think even if we feel disagreement internally, because of the power of authority, we can bend to agree to something that we wouldn't otherwise agree to if that authority wasn't there. But fortunately, in this class, it was never really like that. Professor Miller has always emphasized that there's no wrong answer. You just have to support your argument with good evidence. So in summary, this class has showed me that climate change is not as straightforward as I thought it was. I think if you want to use critical thinking, you have to consider all of the facts, not just a small part of them. So this class has really helped me understand climate change a lot better, but I also think that the concepts we learned in this class can be applied to other aspects of my life as well, because in life it's really rare that you get confronted by issues that are purely black or white or have a single obvious truth or answer at the end of them. But if I can keep an open mind and listen to others, then I can think critically, and from there find the path that feels right to me. Thank you.
Yunchan?
Hi guys, I'm Yusha. So today I'll talk about what I learned from this class and how my BS detector has evolved from this quarter and respond to John Passmore's essay. So we were always taught to be critical. When I prepared for GRE, it is asked for critical reading skills. When I took a writing class, the teacher always said the importance of critical thinking. But despite the fact that the words critical thinking have been talked about many times, I did not think I quite understand what it really was. But throughout this quarter, throughout debating on various aspects and listening to your debates, I get a deeper understanding of critical thinking and how to apply it in real life. I learned that critical thinking is vulnerable. It is subject to manipulation, and most people will not recognize such manipulation. For instance, the majority of media coverage on how severe global warming is actually has successfully influenced the public's perception of that global warming is true and catastrophic. On the other hand, statistics can be misleading, although the data source can be correct. For instance, the 97% consensus commonly used in many articles does not clearly state the sample size or how the researchers chose the sample, so we don't know how representative this result is. But there are lots of factors like this that block our way towards critical thinking. Throughout this quarter, I've gone in depth into the area of climate change and have known much more than the mere concept of global warming that I used to know. One thing I learned that really impressed me the most and shook my perspective was that I realized that economic concerns can be just as important as environmental concerns. Previously, I held the belief that nothing is more important than the sustainability of the Earth, because everything comes back to humankind. It is really short-sighted to develop economy at the cost of environment. But then I learned that during the debates like Alan and Sam and other the government side says that of the environment versus economy. For the first time, I knew that economic development has saved many more lives than from hunger and diseases. The benefit that economic development has brought to us is something that I never took into account when considering global warming. I thought they were really separated.
And my BS detector has also evolved during the quarter and helped me to think more critically. In the beginning of this quarter, when I was watching An Inconvenient Truth by Elgar, I almost took all he says as granted and as truth. But then when it comes to the skeptic environmentalist, I was like, what? Some of his arguments are like totally wrong. So then I realized that the so-called facts may not be facts, and they're all questionable. My BS detector also evolved during the preparation of my own debate. When I firstly watched the migram experiment in a psychology class here, I thought I was crazy for people to follow the authorities' words, even with doubt. But then I realized I would just be one of those people who committed themselves to the authority if I had participated in that experiment. Because without systematic knowledge in global warming, I used to take scientists' words as truth. I don't even have doubts because I don't understand that. But when preparing for my own debate, I found that many authorities in climatology has disagreed very much on the model's accuracy I've talked about last time. And when I realized this, scientists does not have a single consensus. I gradually become skeptical and questionable to these all facts. Now my BS detector constantly reminds me to keep aware of all its arguments and evidence to see does the credibility comes from the source, the evidence, or does the credibility comes from merely the fact that the speaker is an authority in the field. So I shared with the same opinion as John Passmore's opinion on critical thinking that it is hard to teach for a variety of reasons. I always thought that we should think critically before this class, but I do not think I really understand what it was. I took a writing class on environment here, like in English Composition 3, where the professor says, keeps encouraging us thinking critically about global warming, the environmental pollution, but she only encourages us to think about how severe global warming is and why we should care about environment. She never talks about the counterpoints. And this is an example, I think, why in our normal life, critical learning is blocked away from us, and it's really hard. And John Passmore also mentioned the instructional goal need to reconcile with the aim of learning to be critical. I think one way our class did this is through the combination of learning of theories and the practice in real lives. So when writing our journals, which is really hard to write, we are forced by the assignments to be aware of and analyze arguments in real life. It's hard, but it's helpful. And moreover, through evaluating debates and providing feedback, we're asked to make judgments and back up them with reasonable arguments. And I think in this way, our critical thinkings are actually developed. So yes, I hope everyone to be more critical thinking and develop their BS detectors as we learn in class. And thanks for the debates.
Sydney? You can give it after.
Oh, can you? Yeah. Okay, so hi, my name is Sydney. Throughout this class, I learned that we really need to question every side because people are going to be manipulative no matter what side they're arguing. Coming out of my first year of college, I kind of realized, and I was relieved, that authorities here don't force you to believe anything. They can let you think on your own. So today I want to talk about kind of how my critical thinking skills have developed, how my BS skill has developed, and kind of how I don't really take everything authorities say as fact. I'm now not a sponge who kind of absorbs everything as I was before. So in a textbook, the authors characterize critical thinking as sensitive context, reflective, thinking appropriate to a particular mode or domain of thinking. And they say that we can't focus just on our own beliefs and our social perceptions, that we really need to explore other people's ideas. They say to rely totally on either your own thoughts or social influence is dangerous. If individuals engaging in argumentation are not willing and able to think critically, they will be unable to participate effectively in critical decision making. And I think we've seen that a lot in this class. A lot of us came in with a set idea on what we believed in climate change. And then when we did these debates, we looked at everyone else's ideas, we looked at both sides, and we realized that there's a lot more than we thought. We realized that there's other sides that no one's ever exposed us to. Because while we were growing up in class, they taught us climate change is real. Look what's happening. The polar bears are dying. You're killing all of them. But I realize now that you really need to look at everything, because it's better to be more educated and be wrong than to be ignorant and right in your own mind. John Passmore brings up this point in his essay. He says that in school, these teachers taught us, and they were indoctrinating us just to believe in certain facts. They were giving us the base. Many times they were just giving us like the syllabus. They were going through the curriculum so we could pass these state tests. He brought up a good point though when he was talking about a chess game. You can't learn how to develop your own skills in chess unless you learn the rules. You need to know what pieces can go where they move, what skills, what moves they have before you can really develop a strategy. And I think that's really important because without all these years of schooling where they teach you how to read, write, all the facts about history and all that, you don't really have a base to what you can base your critical thinking skills on. If we don't know about history, how can we make an analysis on why a political issue is wrong, or why, if we don't look in the past, how can we know if something's going to turn out right if we repeat history or not? But I think it's also important to notice that these teachers, they don't allow you to really question the ideas. Because I know while I was in school, that even if they gave you an open-ended question, it's like, oh, what do you think Hamlet was talking about in his whole speech? And, there's different ways you can interpret this, but your teacher really has a set idea on what they believe. And oftentimes, you're going to get a higher grade if you write about what they believe. They're going to be like, oh, I like what they're saying. It really goes with my ideas, even if you totally didn't believe anything they were saying. So coming into this class, it's such a relief to know that Professor Miller said there's two sides of the argument, and I'm not going to tell you which one is right or which one I believe in, because I want you to explore it on yourself. And that's what I think is really important coming into college. Going into the Milgram experiment, I've noticed that a lot of people, in the Milgram, they take authorities and say, and accept whatever they say is fact. They believe everything they say. They want to follow them because they are usually the ones who you always look up to. They're the ones deciding a salary or pay or grade. And we never really want to question them in fear of punishment. As kids, if you question your teachers, well, why do I have to raise my hand? It's oh, why do scientists believe this? It'll be because I said so. There's no one ever gives you a reason behind it. And I think that's where your BS detector comes in. Because I saw this thing on Twitter this morning. Actually, they said it was a picture of a polar bear. And it was 120, it was 200 pounds. So this shocking photo reveals the reality of climate change. But that was it. It was a photo of a starving polar bear, which could come from a multitude of things. It could have been sick, it could have been something, and everyone was retweeting and be like, do you guys believe in climate change now? How can you not? Look at this dying polar bear. Wow. But there was no evidence behind it. I think people generalize, they assume things and make assumptions, and everyone uses a bunch of fallacies, and now I've become more tuned to pointing these things out, and I think that's how we can expand it, by pointing when you see things are logically flawed, and pointing it out to other people and just sharing your knowledge is really something you can do to expand your BS detector. You don't have to always be super, super skeptical about things, but call things out when you see them. But I also think when it comes to that stuff, when you learn how to point out fallacies, or you learn what they are, you can use those in your own favor, and that's what people definitely do in their own arguments, because if people don't find them, if you make it so, if you do it perfectly so people can't detect them, your argument is 1,000 times stronger until people question you. So I just think that's the whole thing in this class, is that you need to learn how to critically think and look at other people's ideas, but you can also use the skills people have been using to make your own argument stronger. So just thank you guys for opening my mind and not making me a little sponge anymore who just agrees with everything that people say. Thank you.
Please sit down.
Alright, hello everyone, I'm Jason. So before this class, I'd always been told throughout my education it's really important to think critically. But though I was told that by so many teachers, no one really told me what that meant. It kind of just meant thinking in an educated way. But from Comm 102, I really realized that there's more to critical thinking than that. So for writing this speech, I wanted to boil down what are the most important parts of critical thinking, and how can we use that to go forward and make sure that we take that most important part and use it in our daily lives. So I really wanted to think critically about what it meant to be a critical thinker. And what I came down to was that, in my opinion, the most important part about critical thinking is formulating a good question. I think that's really the first thing that starts the whole process of critical thinking. And so my 3 reasons for why formulating a good question is the most important part about critical thinking is 1, it allows you to understand both sides of the debate. 2, it allows you to synthesize the positives and negatives, the benefits and downsides. And 3, when you formulate a good question, it allows you to get an answer that allows you to come up with a stance for yourself that is stronger. So in this speech, I'm going to talk about questioning from those 3 points of view and relate that to the Milgram experiment, BS detector, and what was the third one? Oh, the Passmore article. So first of all, questioning allows you to understand both sides of the argument. I think that in order to come up with a good question, you're forced to really understand both sides of the argument. And I want to give an example from one of the debates. I thought in the debate about scientific models, because Jung Shun, sorry, did I pronounce your name right? Yeah, okay. I just want to make sure. Because she understood, or because she wanted to ask good questions in her cross-examination, she really prepared herself to understand all the ins and outs of scientific models before the debate. And without the social component of having to question others, she wouldn't have really had to see the downsides to models. She only could have looked at the positive parts. But because she wanted to do well in cross-examination, she was able to gain an understanding of both sides of the argument. The second reason why I think questioning is so important is because it allows you to synthesize those benefits and downsides of both sides of the argument. And I think that this is the part where your BS detector really comes into play, because when you're hearing the answer to that question, you can really start to detect BS, I guess, for a better way to put it. And I think that something that happened to me throughout the course was that at the beginning, my BS detector was way too big. I detected everything to be BS. So I came into the class with a stance that global warming is real, caused by humans, and that there is no other way to look at it. And I think that when asking questions and synthesizing both sides of the argument, it's important to have a BS detector, but I think something that's not mentioned often enough is that you can't make your BS detector too big. And I think that's an important way to look at it. And then thirdly, once you're able to synthesize from the questions you ask, you're able to come up with a better conclusion. And if you look at Professor Miller's definition of critical thinking, I don't have it written down, but he emphasizes the importance of coming to a stance at the end of it all. And by asking good questions, you're able to get answers from the other side of the debate that allows you to come up with a stronger stance. And then, so in our textbook, there's a part, it was in section 10.4, where it actually says how important in the decision-making process questioning is. So I wanted to relate this to the Stanley Milgram experiment, because I think that the Stanley Milgram experiment is a place where questions are not allowed to be asked, because a lot of times when you're in a structured situation where you're just a subject, and how much there?
7 seconds.
Where you're in a situation where you're just a subject and a teacher is just telling you what to do, then you don't necessarily ask those questions to yourself. And when you don't ask those questions to yourself the way that you formulate good questions in any sense of the matter, then you can't think critically. And I wanted to relate this to the Passmore article as well, but I spoke too slowly. So I guess one final point is that Passmore talks about the importance of getting your students to understand both sides of the argument. I think that Professor Miller did a good job of exposing us to both sides so that we could ask these questions for ourselves. Thank you.
I know.
Jenny, your hair is so cute today.
Okay. Hi guys, I'm Jenny.
Okay, hi.
So when looking at both sides of the climate change debate, it was important to be reflective and think independently in order to decide which debate was more qualified for ignorance. So by studying the principles of argumentation, arguing both sides of the climate change debate, I learned several basic skills such as detecting inconsistencies in reasoning, identifying the importance of ideas, and reflecting on the justification reasonings. Of one's own belief, and helped me to become a better critical thinker. So throughout this quarter, my BS detector has also evolved. I analyze situations much more critically now, rather than giving my authorities the benefit of the doubt. I also recognize the importance of engaging in a deep-rooted conversation, highlighted in John Passmore's essay on teaching to be critical to become a good critical thinker. So over the course of the quarter, my BS detector has immensely evolved. I no longer easily fall into the trap of fake news. Fake news has become increasingly common in recent years due to social media platforms, such as Facebook, that spread news like wildfire. It is hard to distinguish what is hardcore news and what is falsely constructed information, but it is important to do so. The consequences are big when you find yourself adjusting your whole life around the post that your friend or quote-unquote an authority figure shares on social media. When people don't evaluate news critically, they don't dare to question what qualifies as real news. Thus, readers are forced into what they should think rather than what they really want to believe in. So, for example, my friend, my roommate, she would read a lot of different weight loss news on Facebook, and she would believe every single one. So she would really. Her trouble was choosing which route to go, so I think in that situation, she didn't really do as much researching, and she would tell me about all these different drinks that help you lose 20 pounds in a week, and for me, I thought that was a little bit bizarre, and for me trying to talk her out of it and making sure she really does research, as in see if different, if there's other resources like scientists that even proclaim that this little, the drink would work. She didn't even do that basics, she just really believed because it got a lot of different likes, and she didn't even read the comments, and all the comments were even beware, this is false, and yeah, so it's basically, in Facebook, it's all about the clicks and likes that just get heightened media. So noticing authorities in my life and analyzing how reactions change depending on who I talk to was extremely surprising. So you can clearly tell who the authority figure is in the conversation. And watching the Milgram experiment, I was also distressed by the fact that participants who were following the commands didn't really question or second guess the constructor of the experiment. So this issue therefore highlights the relationship between the critical thinking versus obedience to authority. So if, for example, my parents ask me to do something, whether it be run errands or do them a favor, I hardly ever think twice and I automatically do what they ask. Well, it's because my parents are the authority figure in my life and I depend on them the most, and they provide and care for me. So from the very beginning, we were taught that children must listen to and obey their parents because it became a whole norm. Obviously, you do want to respect them, but yeah. And then my sister also became an authority figure in my life because of her older age, and she believes that my parents gave her approval to teach me what is from right and wrong. I knew growing up that if I didn't listen to her, there would be consequences from my parents, but once when I actually rebutted her and told my parents totally snapped at her, and it was the best day of my life. However, being older now, I feel more comfortable to question their authority, and they can no longer tell me you're just a child, so you just don't understand. I also learned in this class the value to increase our capacity for critical thinking, and one of the barriers to critical thinking are authorities in our life. I plan to challenge my authorities by questioning their claims not with hostility but with reason, and to include myself in the conversation so my point is shared equally. I must be more courageous to speak up even if I feel less qualified than my authorities. So John Passmore's essay on teaching to be critical emphasizes the importance of engaging in deep conversation. He explains this more in depth using a teacher and student framework, and the authorities like teachers must engage in this type of talk to teach critical thinking to students. But the issue is that one really can't teach others to be critical unless you are also critical yourself. So Passmore also mentions how, as a teacher, you have to have a critical spirit, quote, to develop an enthusiasm for a give and take of critical discussion, quote, to encourage in-depth conversation. So now I understand the importance of critical thinking, and it's not just a matter of having all sorts of information or what you deem as facts. It's also in all that you have to be willing to listen to your opponent and kind of not just have an end goal of who's right or who's wrong. So in all, this class also has helped me become more aware of my surroundings and challenged me to become a better critical thinker, in which now I know how to make use of information to solve problems and look for relevant sources to support my argument. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Patel, and I have a story to tell, and this is going to be really like a kindergarten story, but it's really important. It's about a frog and a fish story. So, a frog, we know it lives in a well, and fish lives in the ocean. So, one day a fish came to a frog and asked a question, do you know how big is the ocean? The frog said, jumped from one end of the well to the other, said, is it this big? And the fish said, you have no clue how big the ocean is. Now, the important point of this story is the difference between the open mind and a closed mind. Here I consider the mind of frog as a closed mind. And before coming to this class, I had similar thinking like a frog. I literally believed that global warming is a fact, and it actually happens. Coming to the thesis, critical thinking is an important habit that we all should develop with an open mind to look both sides of relevant information and conclude based on that. I learned critical thinking through this class by listening all its debates and Professor Miller. First thing, to me, a critical thinker is the one who asks important questions and address problems. Formulate these questions and problems clearly and concisely. For example, if I notice particularly that all our debate topics are very concise and clear. This lead to gather a relevant information, not just for one-sided information, but two-sided information, positives and negatives. Most importantly, to analyze this information and think open-mindedly and with alternative thoughts. Effective communication is also part of thinking critically. If a person has all these qualities or character, I consider them as a critical thinker. Talking about the BS detector, developed over the quarter by listening to debates and cross-examination. And to keep this BS detector alive, I would say question like why the person is telling what they're telling, what is their credibility, and what is their domain knowledge of regarding the topic that we talk about. That doesn't mean that we should always accept information from a credible person, because the authority can become a barrier for the robust critical thinking. Milgram experiment concludes 65% of people are obedient to authority, and I consider my authority to be educators. For example, my professor that I took class of genetics with convinced us that GMOs and there's no difference between GMOs and organic food, like scientifically. And students believe that information because the professor, and we get exams on that, so we just believe it and never think of why, we don't think the other side of it. This is the reason why in the essay on teaching to be critical by Passmore, ask whether being critical is a skill, habit, a subject area, or a character. Even though it is necessary, he argues that calling a person critical is like characterizing them. He states that sorts of teaching which sets out to develop character traits relies to the considerable degree upon what is called atmosphere in the school. And that being said, I say that it is very important for us to teach children to develop all these critical thinking skills. To summarize, I would say critical thinking requires thinking with an open mind, considering both ideas of information, draw conclusion based on convincing side, We should use BS detector while gathering information, and we should continue expand our BS detector. We would generally consider higher authorities to be correct, but they can be a barrier for the robust critical thinking. Because of all this problem, we should start teaching critical thinking to children so that they can make better decisions tomorrow and make a habit of thinking critically. Now, a lot of you thought when I told you the story of a fish and a frog, you thought as a third-person point of view, and we should always look at a problem from a third-person point of view, not from either frog side or fish side. So, thank you.
Hi, sorry.
Can I have it?
Oh, yeah, thanks, girlie.
Thanks.
So, critical thinking is so much more than just being an analytical individual, and after this class, my comprehension of critical thinking has truly evolved. So let's look at my uncle and cousins, for example. My mom is from a very small town in Ohio called Toledo. And although she was able to escape the conservative confines of her hometown, move to Los Angeles, find herself a bomb black man, have me, my uncles and his kids weren't so lucky. It's honestly shocking to me to think that they came from the same parent. Not to offend anyone, but they don't believe in birth contraceptives, they don't believe in medicine for child labor, they don't believe in gay marriage, and they don't believe in interracial marriage. So, I mean, if that was their viewpoints, I'd be like, and they're open for debate, I'd be like, all right, to hell with it, let's go. But they actually don't have any, like, they actually refuse to interact with our side of the family at all for fear that it will corrupt their kids. So with this said, I believe that critical thinking is reliant upon you being open to having your viewpoint challenged so you can further educate yourself and become more aware. And that's clearly not happening with those cousins. Critical thinking is significant because in a world where we are constantly bombarded by conflicting information, like news on climate change, it's necessary for us to have the tools to be able to judge which information is correct. Now, to my BS detector. I've always felt like I've had a strong one growing up, and this instance in particular happened to be particularly alarming. So when my family and I were standing outside of our favorite restaurant, Hillstones in Santa Monica, we had just valeted our car. I was with my dad, the rest of my family, and this white man pulled up in a Range Rover, and he opened his car door for his wife, and I was like, oh, that's cute, chivalry isn't it? But then, turns out, he threw the car keys at my dad, thinking that my dad was a valet. So, my dad then immediately replied, are you effing kidding me? And then he said back, my car's over there. And then my dad just threw the keys inside the middle of the intersection, and he was like, well, your keys are all the way over there. and then after this, my dad was like, seriously, dude, on what grounds did you think that I was a valet? And the guy was so, honestly shocked by the whole debacle that he just couldn't even reply. Because literally the valet guy was right there, to the right of us in uniform. So this notion that this man deserves the benefit of the doubt, he made a mistake, he wasn't paying attention, ding, bullshit alert. My BS detector went off because a simple look at the surroundings would have made it clear that as day that my father was not the valet. Like I said, he was standing next to me and my family, and there was a valet literally a foot away from him. This man committed an obvious, explicit racist act. The Milgram experiment demonstrates our unwavering obedience towards authority. To be on par with the topic we've discussed this entire quarter, because approximately 99% of authoritative figures feel that the over-emission of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has caused climate change, like me, people believe this to be the truth without even conducting their own research. Personally, the Milgram experiment has taught me that simply being a figure of authority does not actually mean you're credible. After this class, my BS detector is always on, no matter who you are, expert or not. Now to quickly touch upon Passmore's 3 main points.
He determined that critical thinking is a skill that can be taught. He clarifies the importance of being an educator rather than an instructor. And he finally explains the methods of teaching to create open-minded critical thinking students. He uses the translator as an example of how critical thinking can be developed as a skill rather than a habit. And this is important because a skill actually takes mental processing, like translating, whereas a habit is like muscle memory. Secondly, Passmore discusses the importance. Passmore discusses the importance of an educator who allows for his pupils to openly question and challenge him in order to come up with their own decisions to help develop their critical thinking skills. Finally, he educates us on the viable method of allowing students to participate in taboo debates and be challenged by their classmates. I discussed the process of critical thinking, its significance, how this class has helped me hone these skills, and the process in which critical thinking should be taught. It should be clear to everyone in this room that my BS detector developed more after this class, the reading of my Milgram experiment, and the Passmore essay. But to be honest, even with the skills that I have developed, I don't even think I can get to my cow milking cousin. So, yes, thank you.